Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, and as I say, today we are going to be reading from Gearld Horne, Counter-Revolution of 1776. That was a robot, Comradesky. Hey, Sarah, welcome in. So we're reading from this work right here. It's called Counter-Revolution of 1776, and it makes the case that the creation of the American quote-unquote nation was not actually a progressive event in the history of humankind. And now we are on right here, chapter 6, which is page 136 if you're following us on a PDF. If you're on, and okay, numbered page 136 as well. The actual page 151. And this chapter is called Arson, Murders, Poisonings, Shipboard Insurrections. The Fruits of the Exhilarating Slave Trade. If the threat to mainland colonies presented by the de facto African-Spanish alliance would have been contained on the Carolina-Georgia-Florida border, it may have been possible to downplay the existential threat to British North America. However, just as London and Madrid were crossing swords in the area just north of St. Augustine and beyond, a series of damaging fires in New York in 1741 raised the specter of taking this conflict into New England, Canada, and beyond, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the British Crown. As an investigation announced tremblingly, there was a wicked and dangerous conspiracy set on foot by white people and diverse Negro slaves and others to burn this whole town and city and to murder the inhabitants. This horrid conspiracy was unraveled while leaving frightening memories of 1712. Another event of insurrection. What was worrisome for some New Yorkers about this reputed plot of enslaved Africans was, like Stono, it too intended to implicate the ambiguous hand of Madrid. Yet, since France, in nearby Quebec, could also lend a hand more readily in New York and New England than it could in Charleston or Savannah, from its perch in Mobile and New Orleans, this also made these events particularly upsetting. London faced a dilemma. The derided Catholic powers were collaborating with Africans, many under the Union Jack, to destroy British North Africa. Nascent London abolitionists would have thwarted this design by becoming more solicitous to Africans. But this could only serve to enrage the settlers, pushing them toward independency, either by being ousted forcibly by Madrid and Paris in league with armed Africans, or being routed by settlers, in league with these very same Catholic powers. London seemed to be destined to relinquish many of its jealously guarded gains in North America. An official investigation of the 1741 conspiracy in New York pointed the finger of accusation at Spain. There was a cry among the people, it was stressed, the Spanish Negroes, take up the Spanish Negroes, quote unquote. Evidence was presented that these Africans with ties to Havana and Madrid were talking of burning the town down, and thus 5 Spanish Negroes were convicted of the conspiracy. One of these gentlemen had been noticeably busy, it was reported, having been concerned with 2 conspiracies in the West Indies, the first at St. John's, and the last at Antigua, in the year 1736. The latter being an especially blood-chilling plot that pretended the total liquidation of European settlement. His punishment for 1736 was being ousted from Antigua. But this time, no chances were being taken. It was declared that the court sentenced him to be burned at the stake. Yet the lesson was not learned altogether, for other defendants were punished by being shipped to Newfoundland. Perhaps a bit of water could have been the reasonable antidote to this fire plot, thought to be centered in Lower Manhattan. But investigators revealed a much larger, villainous design of a very extraordinary nature. That is, the Spaniards had employed emissaries to burn all the magazines and considerable towns in English North America. After all, there were wicked white people who with Africans sought to lay the city in ashes and to murder and destroy the inhabitants, and who too had a hand in the great number of public houses in which Negroes have been entertained and encouraged by rum and other strong liquors, quote unquote, which was a principal instrument to their diabolical villainies. The ominous presence in this plot of those who were defined as white also suggested to the most precipitous settler that an independency gambit had to be accompanied by an attractive enticements by European recruits, lest they be seduced by incentives provided by antagonists of these budding republicans, land seized from the indigenes, and then allotted to recruits, and, after much wrangling, a Bill of Right was one response. This was not the only insight illuminated by incendiarism. Belatedly, it was realized that the liquors that had been an essential element of destabilizing trade offensive in Africa could boomerang, with even Oglethorpe warning that rum and spirits, quote unquote, could destroy the troops and laboring people here as it hath done the armies in Jamaica and Cuba. Sufficiently spooked, the New York authorities sprung into action, offering a reward to any white person that shall discover any person or persons concerned in setting fires. £100 was the sum offered. Quote-unquote Jack a Negro man, who had been convicted in this late conspiracy, aided the state in ferreting out discoveries, and was provided a pardon for his troubles. Africans generally were terrorized in the wake of this plot. The chief victims included Othello and Quack, who agreed to be hung rather than immolated. There were 5 Spanish Negroes, it was said, who had arrived in New York only recently and had been sold as slaves, though it was felt they were pretending themselves as free men. They too were convicted. Then 4 were pardoned, with the 5th unlucky soul executed. Damn, matron, that sounds rough. I've done that once. Let's say I've been careful never to let it happen again. This bloodlust was a priority since the authorities found it dangerous and inconvenient at this juncture for investigators to journey up the Hudson River to Albany in light of the presumed danger and the relative closeness to French Quebec. Especially, it was noted, Tremusely, as they have great reason to be apprehensive that there are many white people and Negroes concerned in the said conspiracy not yet apprehended. Already, New York was nervous about the French presence in Cape Breton and Louisbourg, while the Spanish, or as you would, if you say it if you're from around here, Louisbourg. Already, New York was nervous about the French presence in Cape Breton and Louisbourg. It's French after all. While the Spanish incursion into Manhattan was so significant that their currency was not only circulated but coined there, though this was highly irregular. I've been to Louisbourg a few times. France was known to harbor a corps of battle-tested African in Louisbourg, which motivated the New York legislature to enact a bill to prevent the running away of slaves out of the city and county to Albany, to the French in Canada. Still, despite the real nervousness about the presence of Africans, New York settlers continued to be major players in the slave trade, which guaranteed that disobedient captives would continue to arrive. Yeah, I've been to Louisbourg a few times in Cape Breton. It's like preserved fortress still. So the silly thing about Louisbourg is it's all aimed at defending itself from the sea. So when the English came and invaded them, all they did was come from behind the fort, where it was pretty poorly defended, and they just walked along the land. It's so ridiculous. Some fort you got there, France! Mainland settlers were repeatedly clamoring for more whites, though rarely considering how this laid identity opened the door for a pernicious infiltration by Spaniards and Frenchmen. Did they not fully understand the import of this relatively recent racial identity? Or were they so frightened that they failed and opted for what appeared to be the simplest remedy? Did the growing salience of whiteness tend to ease these religious conflicts? On the other hand, since African slavery was at the root of their enterprise, this sorely limited officialdom's choices for residence and probably intensified the terror aimed at those unfortunate Negroes who, unlike their European allies, could not hide in plain sight and were visibly obvious embodiments of sedition. In the prelude to 1741, officials in neighboring New Jersey were fielding complaints about much damage and molestation from piratical vessels, especially from vessels fitted out from the Spanish islands in the West Indies, particularly Cuba, where armed Africans were known to proliferate. These Spaniards had a growing number of African minds to influence, for the latter's numbers were growing not only in New York, but also in New Jersey. In 1737, there were almost 4,000 Africans in New Jersey, and over the next 8 years, this number increased sharply. The spate of fires that hit Manhattan spread across the river to Hackensack, as 2 slaves were convicted of setting fire to 7 farms in 1741, and were sentenced to be burned at the stake. By 1744, there was an attempt to curb this influx by placing a tariff on imported Indian, Negro, and mulatto slaves. An attempt to raise revenue and heighten security. What made 1741 so intimidating to mainland settlers was not only the breadth of the plot and the context of raging war with Spain in the hemisphere, but the preceding events as well. Stono, remember. In September 1730, a New York City brigantine returned with a terrified crew after a number of Spanish mulatto and African pirates had boarded the vessel and seized its cargo as it sailed through the Windward Passage. In 1736, in Manhattan, a suspicious blaze caused severe damage, which was said to be the handiwork of disgruntled Africans. As with other parts of the mainland, the number of Africans were surging in New York, with little sensitivity to the downstream consequences. According to one source, between 1732 and 1754, more than 35% of those who disembarked at the port of New York were Africans. With the 1740s war, the Spain hampering arrivals from the British Isles and role of Africans in the labor force assumed even greater importance. As the numbers of disaffected Africans increased, also growing were reports of arson. Suspicious blazes had become Manhattan's frequent companion, as alleged acts of arson were thought to be lit by discontented Africans, with women playing a leading role. In short, the conflict with Spain exacerbated extraordinary tenseness, for in addition to the routine hardships visited upon the downtrodden when war arrives, the deployment of armed forces from Manhattan to the Caribbean left this future metropolis vulnerable to the compound vexation of servile insurrection and foreign invasion. Not only did 1741 bring a potentially devastating conspiracy, but it also brought an unsolved crime wave and yet another spate of mysterious fires. Typically panic-stricken colonists turned vigilante and began seizing Africans in the streets indiscriminately and escorting them rudely to the city jailer. Recalled was the reputed participation of Spanish-speaking Africans in the tumult of 1712. If it was any consolation, Catholics of various ascendancies, too, came under heavy pressure. But that only meant that the Anglicans, who were well represented in Manhattan, would receive extra scrutiny. The nervous Manhattanites were not reassured when, during the trial of the accused in the wake of the 1741 plot, discussion emerged about how the defendants had been discussing Admiral Vernon's assault on Portobello, with firm allegiance to London not confirmed. If the truth were ever known, claimed one high-level official, there are not many innocent Negro men, unquote, an opinion that hardened over the decades, if not centuries. They were thought to be inspired by priests sent by Madrid. After this plot was detected, the authorities in New York continued to rail against the encouragement of popery and its dreadful effects, which were also perceived in the propagations of the Moravians. This only worsened an anti-Catholic bias that already was persistent. By then, in many mainland settlements, followers of this faith were doubly taxed. Unable to vote or hold office, possess arms or decent horses, have churches or schools, and, in Virginia, they were not even allowed to be witnesses in any case, civil or criminal. By 1741, about a quarter of New York's population of about 11,000 was African, and understandably, they were seen as prime targets for recruitment by Catholics, who, at times, were treated like them. This bias led to a severe clampdown on Africans from heavily Catholic Cuba sojourning in Manhattan, which in turn deepened the hostility towards the settlers. But the settlers felt they had little choice, not only because of the ongoing tension with Spain, but also because of these particular Africans were adjudged to be free. Then it would be difficult to have testimony of slaves admitted against them, for example, in the trials of the accused in the 1741 plot. Settler apprehensions were confirmed when an African confessed in the aftermath of the uncovering of the 1741 plot that only recently he had been walking and talking with an African from Cuba, and they decided to repair to a tavern for a beer. where he was introduced to this vast conspiracy and asked to take an oath involving setting afire houses and killing slaveholders. I mean, the tendency of mainlanders to improperly dragoon Africans who were subjects of His Catholic Majesty, then enslave them, repeatedly roiled relations between London and Madrid, and deepened the animosity of Negroes, particularly in Cuba, toward their northern neighbors, particularly in the incendiary year of 1741. It seemed that there was a presumption in favor of the alleged slaveholder in mainland courts when an African, or mulatto, or indigene was brought before jurists and claimed as property. This facilitated slavery, but did little for London's reputation among those aggravated groupings. This facilitated slavery, but did little for London's reputation among these aggrieved groupings. It was as if London settlers were telling the world that not only would they refuse to accept an enhanced status for Africans, but they would not accept other powers doing so as well. This may have benefited the settlers, but it could only serve to heighten Africans' antipathy toward London, which was not helpful in hemispheric struggles for power. When during this tumultuous era, Africans were even fleeing French rule in New Orleans for a presumed better life in Havana. This should have emitted a gusty indicator to London as to the direction of political winds. This last point was hard to ignore, for as one contemporary analyst put it, Spanish Negroes were crucial to Madrid's enterprise because they had gained fighting experience while serving in the Spanish fleet. In fact, it was assumed that the Spanish would assault the port of New York, perhaps in response to competitive pressure from Spanish forces by the 1740s. London was employing ever more African regiments, notably in Jamaica, at the time when increasingly African sailors were being employed in many of the major European navies and merchant marines. With mainland draftees continuing to display a notable dearth of enthusiasm for fighting abroad, London's choices were narrowing. As flames were erupting in Manhattan, an officer of the Royal Navy was baleful about not having sailed sooner to Jamaica for want of men, as between 30 and 50 having deserted by the enticements of the people of Boston and the large waves given by the merchants. Nonetheless, just before this, there was sober debate about taking Havana, a place of very great strength, according to one British official. Jamaica was to be the launching pad, with already 500 men raised in Virginia, though little evidence thought was devoted to how normally rebellious Jamaicans might react to the presence of their territory of mainland settlers, with a substantially different attitude toward those of the darkest hue. Yet, despite this deteriorating situation from the Caribbean to Quebec, with the northeastern mainland colonies being outflanked, Massachusetts was reluctant to move away from the moth-eaten policies. No Indian, Negro, or mulatto, except one servant of a captain's, was allowed to be enlisted or retained to serve at His Majesty's castle, guarding the entrance to the main port. Though friction with Spain was increasing, Massachusetts lawmakers found it necessary to debate a bill designed to prevent mutiny and desertion, yet stepped up efforts to bar Africans. A call was made to recruit 1,000 men to send to the Caribbean, with a bounty dangled as an emolument. In fact, the Esquire was strained by further inducements. For example, more billeting money, as the original sum was deemed insufficient. Two men petitioned for more funds in light of their extraordinary experience in raising companies of volunteers for the expedition to the Spanish West Indies, though there was still reluctance to deploy Africans at the prime castle in Boston, a port city thought to be more civilized than Charleston. As intensified pressure was placed on Africans in Manhattan in the aftermath of the 1741 plot, due north in Boston, there were groans about the defenseless condition of a fortress of the utmost importance to the safeguard of the province. This was the case, though simultaneously it was reported that 2,400 of His Majesty's finest men from this province were involved in hostilities in Cuba. It was felt appropriate to dispatch 1,000 Negroes to this distant clime. However, this latter move could cause this victimized group to espy a group of their type facing different circumstances than within the Bay Colony, possibly implanting seditious ideas, or causing them to be less prone to accept bigotry after jeopardizing life and limb on behalf of the crown. Since it was acknowledged that more men were needed for this Cuban venture, this could only increase the importance of Africans, who were less able to demand more funds, more billeting money, and the like. Thus, as the battle in the Caribbean was coming to a head, one white soldier successfully petitioned to be granted 100 acres of the unappropriated lands of the province in full satisfaction in enlisting soldiers for the expedition against the Spaniards. Though this could have well brought the colony into further conflict with expropriated indigenes, Africans were hardly in a position to demand as much. Telling was that even local policymakers had taken great pains to discourage conscription, an indicator of the growing separateness from the crown. Simultaneously, one Scottish writer recalled that when the time arrived for Admiral Vernon and his officers to attack the Spanish Caribbean in early 1740s, the 1,000 Negroes that carried from Jamaica on that expedition was sufficient force to have taken the whole town of St. Jago de Cuba, which, if true, upgraded the importance of Africans as it downgraded the need for enlisting mainland settlers. Furthermore, some local leaders were objecting to the enlistment in the Crown's forces of the indigenous, though they had acquitted themselves well in combat in Canada in 1711. Apparently, there was both racist and pragmatic concern about these potential recruits. The latter grounded in reluctance to see a group that had yet to be subjected wholly to receive military training. In short, settlers were both resisting fighting and seeking to block others from doing so, calling into question their viability as subjects. Still, one outgrowth of the developing political trend was the opening of more opportunity for mainland settlers, with the entire province of Georgia, for example, desiring Africans. For example, Rhode Island's reputation as a headquarters for the trade in Africans increased after this turning point of the 1740s, as Spanish interests absorbed mighty blows, despite, perhaps because of, Spain's Manhattan offensive. This included more Africans being brought to Newport, not to mention others being dragged to the southern colonies and beyond, particularly to the Caribbean. This profit, in turn, stimulated more dreams of independency. A not atypical Rhode Islander was Godfrey Malbourne, who had major interests in both Newport and the base of Independency, Virginia, where he owned 50 enslaved Africans. This association of Newport with the slaveholders' dominion that was Virginia was hardly happenstance, since the former harbor town at this juncture was as busy or busier than Boston or New York, engaged in a highly preposterous trade with the Caribbean and Africa. The first of the enslaved arrived there in 1690. The profit on one journey to Africa could be as much as $6,500. In the middle of the 18th century, marked a turning point for the mainland, as represented by the reality that in 1730 Rhode Island, an African population of 1,648, but by 1755 this number had almost tripled, and then represented 11% of the province's population. As the number of Africans in the Northeast increased, this made this region ever more similar to the Southeast, uniting the two, providing both with further reason to support slavery, to resist slave revolts, and to question the trend in London, to rely upon Africans to confront Madrid. All of this was occurring as the Crown was beginning to place more emphasis on its mainland investments, as Jamaican Maroons and Antiguan seditionists continued to give Caribbean settlers reason to make the great trek to the mainland. Thus, ships from this ocean-bound colony, anchored by Newport, suffered frequently from shipboard slave uprisings, probably because it was the leader among the provinces in this hateful commerce. The first mover's advantage it gained in the aftermath of slave trade reforms continued to be felt. A revealing indication occurred well before the acceleration of the slave trade in the middle of the 18th century, when a Newport vessel headed for the Caribbean with almost 100 enslaved Africans aboard and suffered a devastating revolt. Perhaps as a result, there was significant pressure internally for Rhode Island to move towards European indentured labor, as the province's chief executive argued that the unruly tempers of the Africans made them unsuitable as a mass labor force. Of course, such a shift did not preclude the reality of Newport slave ships continuing to dump Africans in the Southeast. The assimilation of Africans in the province proceeded fitfully, which should have alerted wary settlers of the perils of African alienation. The eminent Urza Stiles was disturbed to find that the majority of Africans in Newport refrained from attending local Christian churches, for reasons he found hard to fathom. Nevertheless, if there was a challenger to Rhode Island in this dubious category of insurrections aboard slave ships, it may have been Massachusetts. This province was a leader in both slave trading and falling victim to shipboard insurrectionists, all of which engendered further hatred of Africans on the part of families of murdered ship crews, their communities, and others, as ripples of resentment continued to flow. Y'all with me so far? Yep, I told you that, and I did tell you that in another chat, didn't I? I'm pretty sure we had this discussion. in, whose chat was that? Who was it? It was either Dave's or Landham's. Yep, no worries though. Yeah, like I said then, we got very lucky. Somebody drove across the Ontario border and sent us a CPAP machine that they never used, that they bought brand new, never opened. They sent it to us. He drove over the border from Chicago or some shit to New York, or I don't know where he was, Buffalo or something like that. It's somewhere. He drove over the border to Ontario anyway and shipped it to me so that we didn't have to worry about it going through customs or anything. So yes, we have the CPAP. Now we are raising money for... What's this? Now we're raising money for car parts right now. Buddy, how am I gonna throw this? How am I gonna throw this? Okay, here you go. Yeah, so we're just trying to get car parts now. Car parts. And maybe a new microphone soon. This microphone is part of my problem, see? I don't know if you can see, there's a big dent in it right here. Like if you look at the rest of it and then you look right here. Yep. Thankfully I have a big Twitter follower now, then somebody saw us. We just had to get a few doodads, get a new mask because the mask didn't quite fit her. So we just gotta get a new mask and the car parts, and we're in a hell of a lot better shape than we were, that's for sure. Although, if you do like the Leaping Larry channel, I do say support the Leaping Larry channel because, if you don't know, my channel runs solely on your support. And ever since picking up, I'm on disability myself. My wife is a veterinary assistant, so we're on the very low end of the earning scale. And we picked, after my mom had a stroke, we picked up more expenses as well. So if you are able to gift some subscriptions to your comrades, if you're able to subscribe yourself, if you're able to cheer some bits, that all keeps our channel going. That keeps the readings happening. It keeps the Juche gang live longer. And you can also support by doing direct donation to my PayPal. You can also do a direct donation through my socials as well. If you go to the bottom of my beacons page here, this is also a direct donation button you can use. Or you can even, if you want to help out in another way, you can even just share my post here as well. So support the channel. It literally keeps the channel going, most importantly. Biddies, gift subs, subscribing yourself. If you have a Prime subscription, you could use that on here. You know, that goes a long way. Or a direct donation. I'll just let those who might be able to afford such a thing mull it over. And I'm just catching my breath, and then we'll continue on with a read here of Gearld Horne. And I appreciate your consideration in supporting our channel here, comrades. Hi, Giddy. All right, let's continue. See, I hate shilling because I always feel like people leave as soon as I do it. But that could just be coincidence. And I feel like I'm like putting it on the same people every time, which makes me feel weird. Because it's always the same people, even though, and that's my fault for not growing the channel better. And then I feel bad, I feel like weird about that, you know? The fact that I should be doing more to grow the channel and not having it like rest on the same people every single time. Definitely my responsibility to do that if I want to keep going and streaming full time anyway. Anyway, let me continue. There was a noticeable acceleration of shipboard revolts beginning at the midpoint of the 18th century, when commercial interests were in the process of retreating from or being chased away by rebellious Africans in the Caribbean to the mainland and were seeking to bring along more enslaved Africans to develop North America. To the credit of the Africans involved, God dang, this word sucks. Wait.
Contumaciousness probably helped to decrease.
Contumaciousness. See, it's good to have that. Oh my god, now I just lost my page. No. Don't do that to me. Apparently it is. Consummationist. I want to read it up. I wanted to look it up, but I got all excited and closed the book somehow. Here it is. Okay, so it comes from archaic law, especially of a defendant's behavior, stubbornly or willfully disobedient to authority.
Contumacious.
Contumacious. Got it. There you go. To the credit of the Africans involved, their contumaciousness probably helped to decrease the number of Africans who were to be enslaved, as their militancy placed a high premium on slavery that many Europeans were unwilling to pay. This was discovered by the Irishman Nicholas Owens when, in December 1750, he set out from Liverpool to enchain Africans as slaves. Arriving in West Africa, he quickly arranged for the detention of 80 unfortunate souls, who were packed inside a vessel with a cargo of ivory. But then, he made the misfortune of encountering a former French ship staffed by Africans who had slain their captors and commandeered the vessel. Owens and his crew tried to overawe these Africans, but as he recounted, the slaves behaved so as to make us give over the attempt with loss on our side. Quote unquote. Then Owens and several of his mates were seized by Africans and enslaved in retaliation before escaping. Similarly, the Caribbean, notably Jamaica and Antigua, had garnered a well-deserved reputation for developing African bellicosity, and came to be disfavored in this regard by the notorious Negro merchants, who began increasing their commerce in Africa itself, rather than engaging in transshipments of human cargo from these islands. Disrupting the link between the Caribbean islands and the mainland drove the latter provinces closer together, solidifying bonds which too stimulated more dreams of independency. Traveling to Africa for slaves meant the ensuring of more venomous discord, bolstering more anti-African bias, jeopardizing the flexibility of London if it contemplated heeding nascent abolitionism by seeking to better confront Madrid but co-opting Africans. Thus, by May 1747, off the coast of Guinea, Africans rose against their European captors and killed a number of them, though 2 of the crew jumped overboard to escape. In 1754, there was an uprising of Africans aboard a Bermuda slave vessel. Strikingly, an individual identified as a Spanish slave was said to have murdered the captain and other European mariners. Since Robert Pringle, Henry Lawrence, and numerous other mainland entrepreneurs used Bermudian vessels to correspond with their counterparts elsewhere, and since mainland periodicals routinely credited Bermudan captains with reporting major events, the 1712 revolt in Manhattan, for example, this revolt was not easy to ignore. This was particularly true for Lawrence, who was to become a leading rebel against London's rule rather shortly, and whose immense slave holdings would be jeopardized if abolitionist stirrings and increased solicitude towards Africans became reality. He was one of the mainland's largest slave traders, and had close ties to Newport and Philadelphia. As the slave markets of the Caribbean were transformed in the mid-1750s, he played a key role as Africans were sent to his homeland, South Carolina, from French slavers. He controlled a vast business empire, but trade in Africans was at the center of his many dealings. London's colonies in the hemisphere were not one wholly unitary unit, but it was fair to say that events in one portion reverberated in another, as suggested by the exodus to the mainland after Antigua in 1736 and the impact on the mainland of the contemporaneous ongoing revolt of the Maroons in Jamaica. Thus, when in 1753 a major uprising of Africans rocked Barbados, which involved inter alia beating to death a European man, the case received somber headlines due north, especially in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Hey, fuck, that's like the third time we've been mentioned. See, the thing was, though, Halifax was a military outpost for the British, as I said before. The whole city of Halifax was sort of like the counter to Fortress Louisbourg in France. And at the same time, the fortress here in Canada to go ride out and fight wars against native people. Like I said, the old wealth of Halifax that still exists today was gained in the scalping of Mi'kmaq people. The old money of Halifax can still be traced back to that. Nova Scotia was very busy during the slave trade, during the fucking wars against native people, so on and so forth. The settlers on this sugar island were lucky, in a sense, since the uprising was aborted before the enslavement had launched their intended total destruction of the settlers. The acceleration of the slave trade as the middle of the 18th century approached revived the old argument about the Royal African Company versus private or separate traders. And to that extent, it was proper for colonists, be they in Barbados or Bermuda or Baltimore, to see their fates as conjoined, since the fuel for their development, Africans, arrived from the same source. Quote, will not every British planter in America and every West India merchant, it was argued in 1745, grant that the Negro trade on the coast of Africa is the chief and fundamental support of the British colonies and plantations in America? What if London's most formidable rivals, for example, Paris, monopolize the whole African trade to themselves? Will they not naturally furnish their own colonies with the best of Negroes and suffer Englishmen to purchase their refuse only? And that too at an exorbitant rate. Unquote. Was it not true that the wealth and naval power of Great Britain is, in a great measure, owing to the extensive commerce and navigation to and from its American colonies and plantations, and that these must be totally ruined and undone if unsupplied with Negroes? Unquote. What would happen if Paris made alliances with local Africans, just as it had been doing with mainland Africans? Would a bunch of diffuse private traders be capable of mounting a counteroffensive like the Crown could? But the RAC had been losing momentum steadily since the late 17th century. By 1749, the forts on the coast of Africa, so needed for the propulsion of this odious commerce, were in great distress. It was reported. The idea was taking hold in certain London quarters that the homeland was losing the race for wealth and influence to Paris because of the latter's supposed advantage in dominating the African slave trade. And this, it was said, was due to the erosion and strength of the RAC, dissolved to the great joy of both the Dutch and French, which was a scandal. The Negro trade alone, quote unquote, was of a most prodigious consequence, and during the heyday of the RAC was the most flourishing of any in the kingdom, and the most beneficial to this island of all companies that ever were formed by British merchants. Unquote. This trade was of momentous significance for the Caribbean holdings of London, which could hardly be maintained if France dominated the commerce in Africans from its bases in West Africa and Hispaniola. And it could have been aided by mainland settlers. This French upsurge had laid a sure foundation to supplant Britain in its whole American commerce in general. With urgency, it was asked rhetorically, are we not indebted to those valuable people, the Africans, for our sugars, tobaccos, rice, rum, and all other plantation produce? And the greater number of Negroes imported into other colonies from Africa, will not the exportation of British manufacturers among the Africans be in proportion, they being paid for in such commodities only? Was it true that the general navigation of Great Britain owes all its increase and splendor to the commerce of its American and African colonies? Yet, the French had the upper hand in Africa, it was maintained, since in the parts of Africa where they resided, they were the only purchasers of Negroes, and consequently, having no bidders against them, they were able to make their own market. Contrarily, the case is quite otherwise on those parts of the coast where the British Company have settlements, because of the competition brought by the separate purchasers or private traders. This naturally rises the price of Negroes, to the detriment of London's overall interests. Moreover, Paris did not tax enslaved African imports to its colonies as much as London did, perhaps providing another advantage. Hence, if Paris gained the upper hand in the slave trade, London's colonies would be obliged to depend on the labor of white men to supply their place, which would not be competitive, and perhaps worse. They would either soon be undone or shake off their dependency on the Crown of England. For white men cannot be obtained near so cheap, unquote. A point recently thrashed out in Georgia, emphasis original. For if this were to occur, and white men supplanted Negroes in planting, this would mean the drain of the country's husbandmen, mechanics, and manufacturers too, ruining Britain's economy. The provincial tail wagging the metropolitan dog, and being savaged by a French mutt, was what was envisioned, and the decline of the RAC was an essential part of this nightmare. London was trapped in a rickety contraption of contradictions that all seemed to point towards shedding, perhaps involuntarily, a good deal of its holdings in North America. There was a tendency in London, and certainly among the settlers, to see enslaved Africans and its inevitable complement, the slave trade, as essential to a robust confrontation with its European antagonists. But the kind of slavery being imposed in London settlements was even more repugnant to many Africans than the situation in Havana and Cape Breton, which were more willing to erect a buffer of free Negroes. This may have been an acceptable burden for London, except that its crafty colonists were busily cutting deals with those same antagonists. France, most notably, which was to eventuate in 1776. And these manipulative settlers decreased the maneuverability of the crown when they railed at the idea of such a buffer besides. It was not as if London was unaware of the dangerous path the settlers and they themselves were pursuing. The Earl of Egmont was told as much by a premier settler, William Byrd of Virginia, when the latter observed that growing number of Africans make them insolent, and foul means must do what fair will not, creating a public danger or the fearsome servile war. So he said as early as 1736, consider, quote, an end to this unchristian traffic, lest they prove as troublesome and dangerous everywhere as they have been lately in Jamaica. Site of the militant Maroons. We have mountains too, he reminded London, and so as much mischief as they do in Jamaica could arrive on the mainland. Hey Falcon, welcome comrade. Great to see ya. Byrd's words were comprehensive, since there were an estimated 6,000 Africans in Virginia in 1700. But by 1756, there were more than 120,000. There were about 1,000 Africans next door in North Carolina in 1700. By 1730, there were 6,000, and by 1765, about 65,000. Popped in to hell yeah, you popped in to dip your rod in the water. Well, you get one free exclamation fish per hour. And here's a secret, Falcon, that I've let comrades know about as well. I often forget the fishing game open on stream, and what comrades have discovered is that if I do leave the fishing game open and my stream isn't running, you can still fish. You don't see the graphics, but you can still fish. And it still comes up in chat and tells you what you caught. So I have noticed, comrades, after stream, while I'm not streaming, I have noticed some people fishing during those times. So you get one free exclamation mark fish per hour. The other ways that you can fish, though, if you cheer bits, you fish for every one bit you cheer. But do them individually if you want to fish more than once, unless you want to just be nice and give me multiple bits at once. When you subscribe to the channel, you throw a line in the water. And when you gift subs on the channel, you throw a line in the water. And however many subs you gift is however many lines you throw in the water. So if you gift 5 subs, you get 5 lines in the water. Yes, to get multiple bits, you need to do like 1 bit, then 1 bit, then 1 bit, then 1 bit, then 1 bit, if you want to do multiple bits. Oh, you've tried when I wasn't online. See, sometimes I do close it. Sometimes I do close it. But oftentimes I forget to close it. So, just a heads up, you never know when you'll come in, type that fishing thing when I'm not online and catch a fish. Could happen anytime. Alright, let me continue. We got like 10 pages left. 11. We got like 11. 12 pages. We got like 12 pages left. See, reading takes a long time. This is kind of why I'm thinking we're going to move this to Discord at a certain time. Because I still have so much more shit to get to today. But anyway, let's go. As the numbers of Africans grew, measures to bar their insurrection were passed, with their subversive activity deepening enmity toward them, lubricating the path to both opposition and incipient abolitionism, and increasing enmity towards Londoners who moved in that direction. After a knockdown battle in Georgia, the enslaved African population increased dramatically between 1750 and 1766. The number of the province's Negro denizens grew from around 500 to about 7,800. Even the powerful Bird and the Earl of Egmont seemed powerless in the face of those merchants and planters who refused adamantly to halt the slave trade, which was to create a momentum for succession. The wider point was that as the number of enchained Africans grew, the number of furious Africans grew too, meaning the plotting against slavery was also increased at a frenetic pace. This intensified the anxiety of the settlers, which was not assuaged when signs of incipient abolitionism or even recruiting and arming Africans to better confront His Catholic Majesty began to surface in London. Instead of bowing to this sentiment, some settlers moved in an opposing direction. In North Carolina in 1754, there was a concerted effort to hamper those who were seeking to curb the trade in human beings. Even the clandestine trade from the Cape of Good Hope to Madagascar was approved since, to do otherwise, it was said, violated the rights of major merchants. Curbing the slave trade to the mainland in the mid 18th century was difficult at best. And whether these barriers failed or succeeded, the subsequent momentum created was tending to facilitate independency. Love to hear that. Love to hear the settlers getting anxious, don't you? You just love to hear about a settler getting good and anxious. It's nice. It's just nice, you know? Oh, it's gonna make this joint so sweet when I smoke it. Anyway, the larger point was that, to a degree, the region sprawling from the northeast part of North America through the Caribbean to South America was a unitary theater of conflict. And the obdurate attitudes towards Africans that had calcified in the area stretching from Savannah to Boston were often counterproductive to London's larger schemes. Notably, the need to divert capital and troops to India, which, as was mentioned earlier in this book, London was more and more seeing to be the better investment, the better colony to focus on than North America in many respects. Notably, and in large part because of this threat from African slave trade, right? And that threat being revolting Africans and their indigenes and other allies, right? And even allying with the French and the fucking Spanish when they can, in order to use this French, not because they thought the French and Spanish were like better than fucking the English, but because they recognized that they could use them in their own liberatory struggle. Which is, by the way, the irrelevant and mistaken criticism that Midwestern Marx makes about this book, saying that Gearld Horne talks about London and talks about London, Spain, and French as if he's like romantic towards them or something, but we have seen nothing of the sort through this entire read. And one of the reasons why I wanted to read this book was specifically the Midwestern Marx attack against Gearld Horne in their Purity Fetish book, right? Where they did try to portray him as being sympathetic towards Britain. It's like, no, he's pointing out that Africans were able to use all of these world powers, Spain, France, and the English, and to take advantage of them in their struggle against slavery, in their revolting against slavery. And that what 1776 wasn't a revolution for independence, but a counter-revolution to hold on to the slave trade and to perpetrate and to continue with the ongoing genocide of First Nations as well and expand the US. Which is the main point of the argument of this book. Like, if you have contention with that, then see me after class, because I have some things to say to you. And if you've seen me interact with Noah, you might know what those things are already. Yeah, don't get me started, Sam. Don't get me started. The larger point was that, to a degree, I'm going to just read this. I'm just going to read this whole paragraph again because I kind of like went off on a little tangent there. The larger point was that, to a degree, the region sprawling from the northeastern part of North America through the Caribbean to South America was a unitary theater of conflict. And the obdurate attitudes towards Africans that had calcified in the area stretching from Savannah to Boston were often counterproductive to London's larger schemes. Notably, the need to divert capital and troops to India. This thought may have occurred to the New York merchantman Charles Hicks, who had been residing in South Carolina for years, before arriving in St. Augustine, at an emotionally charged moment between London and Madrid. There, he saw hundreds of armed Africans, including some who had fled Carolina and others from Veracruz. In fact, he thought the Spaniards there had great dependence upon the Negroes and therefore were very desirous of another expedition to Charleston, assuming that Africans there would join their assault. Indeed, he well knew that former Spanish prisoners in Carolina used to tell the Negroes there that they would come for them, and the Negroes seemed well pleased, quote unquote. However, London found that despite the cost in lives and funds, the easier course was to wage war against Spain and eliminate this threat rather than to seek to alter the policies and attitudes of mainland settlers. Thus, in 1743, when it had been thought that the southern border had been pacified, leaders were still being annoyed by the Spaniards who were urging Africans across the border to commit massacres and assassinations and the burning of houses. For example, what had transpired in Manhattan. This was proof, said officialdom, that His Majesty's subjects are never likely to be free from their horrible and mischievous endeavors until an enemy so barbarous be removed. But London, which already controlled a gigantic and growing empire, could hardly afford to shun indefinitely the idea of arming Africans en masse, not least when mainland settlers often seemed so reluctant to enter into combat. Moreover, unrest was already bubbling over in Scotland and manifesting itself in Boston, leading to a grand revolt north of England. In the 1740s, at a time when London was seeking to confront a daunting challenge from Spain. The epochal Battle of Culloden in 1745 caused some Scots to look back in anger at the Act of Union of 1707, bringing Scotland more firmly into the United Kingdom, with one ex-Arabic critic arguing that the Concord was corrupted since it was brought about by the distribution of sum of money among the Scots aristocracy, and greatly against the wishes of the Scottish nation in general. Unquote. Recalled was a 1719 plot hatched in Spain to invade and overturn the 1707 Pact, with plenty of Scottish aid, it was thought, which was only nipped in the bud at the final moment. Hey, 69. A compliment to London's plan a few years earlier to aid Catalonians in revolt against Madrid. A Scot visiting Jamaica in the 1740s noted knowingly that the Scots abroad are very remarkable for standing by their countrymen, most of all the Scots I knew in Jamaica. He reminded resolutely were Jacobites, not necessarily good news for the crown. Some of those who were defeated at Culloden were exiled to Maryland, where they could enjoy further opportunity to make devilment at the crown's expense. Aha, devilment. Thus, writing in 1746, a Scot visiting Jamaica espied a conspiracy among the Negroes for a general insurrection to destroy all white people. The Africans he encountered were stubborn, resolute, and revengeful creatures in their own way, exhibiting low cunning which they employ in theft or revenge. There were computed to be about 10,000 Negroes there, and by the law of the country, for every 10 Negroes there ought to be one white man. But this had been so little observed that he found only one white man for 50 Negroes. And the white servants that come are sent hither are the very scum of the earth, and generally speaking prove good for nothing. Unquote. Worse, in Cuba were, quote, much better government and discipline among the Negroes. This Scot seemed as if he wanted to opt for the Spanish model when he spoke of meeting a Jamaican of Negro parents educated in England, who was a super genius, leading him to conclude that it was not color but genius and education that makes the man, a thought that would not necessarily be embraced on the mainland. Yet, even this thoughtful Scot drew the line at Jews, opting for a less forthcoming attitude, which could only narrow the base of support for London in the region. This was all very worrisome, but given that it was a Scot writing at a time of unrest in Scotland, London, justifiably, could have viewed his words with jaundice. Was he simply seeking to mislead? Was his implicit praise of Spanish Cuba an indirect indictment of his true loyalties? Was his anti-Semitism a further way to undermine the crown? If London had to look askance at reports from perpetually restive Jamaica that indicated brewing troubles just because it emerged from a Scot, might this be an indication to pull back altogether from this island and relocate to the mainland? Or perhaps it meant that the crown should rely more heavily on Africans and less on potentially disloyal whites who happen to be Scottish? It was estimated subsequently that 1/3 of whites in Jamaica were Scottish, suggestive of the crown's perplexities. If Scots were considered to be unreliable politically, then London would be inched ever closer to the remedy of increased arming of Africans, which would then serve to jeopardize further the allegiance for mainland colonies. You see this explosive situation they have on this hand? They literally have this bundle of contradictions that they cannot solve, right? The colony building, the empire building has led to all of these contradictions that they cannot solve without losing substantial parts of the empire, or without having revolt of Africans all over the empire. So the way London saw it, it was either they further exacerbate these settlers and drive them towards independence, or they continue on with the slave trade as they're going and threaten the entire fucking colonial system altogether. Whether it's in North America, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in London, or whether it's in India, right? So this is the dilemma that they're faced with. This knot of contradictions that is impossible to undo by maintaining colonialism. So this is what they're left with. Compounding the dilemma was the point that London also had to be concerned about the presence of Dutch residing in its mainland colonies. Not only in Manhattan, but in Savannah also. Holland had been ousted from ruling Manhattan and the vicinity merely decades before, and London had reason to believe that not all in this province had been reconciled to British rule. Not to mention the perception that Spain's previous rule of part of the Netherlands had left a deep imprint there, inimical to London's interests, which could be transferred across the Atlantic. In elite colonial circles, analyzing and unpacking whiteness appeared to be anathema, which could only allow festering problems to flourish. Ethnic and religious tensions between and among Scots and Irish and English, and the Dutch in the first place. Such tensions weakened the colonies, making them easier to fall prey to foreign invasion or insurrectionary Africans, or both. Thus, London routinely demanded more white settlers in its provinces in the Americas, while it was well understood that this did not mean all who fit this description. For example, those with sympathies to Madrid and Paris, but this was hardly articulated. It was as if the elite did not interrogate whiteness, then no one else would either. And the inherent frailty of this unstable category would somehow magically disappear. By 1745, the question of how to protect the colonies, while some settlers were bent on flooding the streets and plantations with Africans, had been broached in the streets of London. At this juncture, the Cartagena debacle and calamitous events such as the Stono and Manhattan revolts, all of which implicated the destabilizing role of Africans, were well known. By that point, South Carolina was in a familiar pose, on its knees, begging the Crown to send more troops to confront its multiplying internal and external foes. Of course, said one Londoner skeptically, these troops were to be paid from Great Britain, but under the command of the governor? Though this combination had hardly eliminated the threat from abroad and at home, it is very certain that South Carolina is overstocked with blacks in proportion to the number of white people, said this astringent critic. After data from customs there were examined, it was noted that Charleston was bringing from 2,000 to 3,000 Africans annually to its shores. As George Burrington saw things, if the will and means could be galvanized to make proper laws and regulations to restrain the rich planters from keeping dangerous numbers of Negroes, then London would not be at the expense of paying standard forces to keep them in obedience. There was a certain logic to this view, but it clashed sharply with the hegemonic views of the rich, not least Henry Lawrence, who within years was to be revered as the founding father of the new republic. It's a noble cause, Radisby. It's a noble cause. Burrington's point was echoed in Georgia, where one settler observed that, quote, Negroes would be hurtful in Georgia as long as there was a war with Spain. The problem was, said John Dobell, that some of his fellow Georgians were stark mad after Negroes, and quite literally were willing to risk poison in order to effectuate their demented schemes. Yet, in what was to be a commonplace in the post-1776 Republic, there was an astonishingly broad, white, unified front demanding more slaves in Georgia. Quote, I find that all from the highest to the lowest vote for Negroes, Dobell was told by a comrade, and look upon me as a stone in their way towards which they direct all of their spite. Dirty tricks were suspected in pursuit of their goal, as this correspondent had fear that his letters may be intercepted. His opponents were so exceedingly bold as to bring over black slaves in defiance of the king and express orders, and at a dangerous time of war, when Africans were known to be unwilling to defend the Union Jack. Moreover, Burrington and Dobell could have mentioned that it was not only Charleston that was clamoring for more redcoats, a presence that would have subsequently be scorned when billeted in local residences, helping to shape a successful rebels' vaunted constitution. For Delaware also demanded more British military men. They were absolutely necessary too, it was added, to supply the West India Islands with bread, meat, lumber, and many other things, involved in an extensive bilateral trade involving 400 ships or more, which enriched the Esquire in London, though there was nearby not any fortification which jeopardized Philadelphia. In Maryland in 1745, there was fear of invasion from the French and Spanish, which was bound up in the religious politics and the crisis in Scotland, and a resultant request for fully manned battleships. Due south in North Carolina, the governor was pleading for more British troops in 1753, since if redcoats were visible, quote, the Negroes who have lately attempted an insurrection will have the less to discourage them to repeat their attempts. Plus, fortifications at the mouth of this river, near Wilmington, were in a defenseless condition. There was also a growing contraband trade, particularly of French rum and molasses, which was fortifying the Parisian foe. This was not a unique problem. Georgia was formed in large part to blunt Spanish Florida, but its formation extended London's border dangerously close to the French domain in Mobile. By 1754, the governor of Georgia was irritatedly demanding troops, since the French were conspiring to persuade the Indians to attack the English. As ever, there was suspicion about the French, since they were not perceived as being sufficiently anti-African, and were willing, like Madrid, it was thought, to dispatch African agents to stir up the enslaved on the mainland. Burrington's fellow British subject, Henry Ellis, who had served the crown as a governor on the mainland, also sought a remedy for the fix in which the settlers found themselves. It was Ellis who recommended forming a buffer class of free Negroes and mulattoes between Europeans and Africans, not unlike what was evolving in southern Africa and parts of Latin America. To be fair, so do I, but I'm not an American, Radispe, so I feel you there. He proposed that enslaved Africans should be freed at the age of 30 in Georgia, he ruled. I don't even know where the fuck Georgia is, if I'm being real with you. But as with a similar proposal in Virginia, it met with a stone wall of resistance by settlers determined to construct a racist despotism. This was also a course of action that complicated the effort to checkmate the more expansive attitude toward Africans that obtained just across the border in St. Augustine. Just above Florida? Thank you. That helps me imagine things. Thanks, comrades. Africans, in short, were a major antagonist, but mainlanders were reluctant to curb the seemingly ceaseless flow of Africans who were arriving, which was raising searching questions in London about their judgment, if not their sanity. It was still true that in the 1740s in Charleston, there was a search for revenue combined with apprehension about racial ratios that led to an attempt to tax slave imports. According to policymakers, the supposed barbarous and savage disposition of these Africans may hereafter prove a very dangerous consequence to the peace and safety of this province. A concern driven by memories of Stono and their barbarously murdering settlers. The only question to decide was if the purchaser or the importer should pay these duties. Though, if history was any guide, this province would continue its proven ruinous course. Charleston, as a major port of entry for enriched Africans on the mainland, often set the pace for its slave-owning neighbors. So yes, there were mainland leaders who realized that unleashing more Africans in their midst was a recipe for a debacle. But with planters retreating from Antigua and Jamaica to the mainland, and a continent to conquer, alternatives to the present course were few. Before being ousted, Oglethorpe had warned of the mutinous temper in Savannah, fomented by the Spaniards, which was but part of their scheme for raising a general disturbance through all North America. Their correspondence with the Negroes, he advised, too fatally manifested itself in the fires of New York. But his was a voice hardly heeded. Yeah. Yeah, Delaware, from what I understand, is like a hot spot as well because of that. Or it seems like from this book anyway, that is. Yet by early 1744, some elite Carolinians were soberly pensive. The Africans were quiet, but they had not always been so. And in any case, recent stormy events they had spawned in Antigua, New York, and Jamaica were sufficient warnings of the danger of this force that may be turned against them. Like others of that time, they recognized that they had to be alert to events, not only in their backyard, but also in colonies thought to be distant. Most likely, Madrid felt that as long as there were Africans in the colonies north of Florida, there was a chance that London's rule could be toppled. For a few months later, a Georgian was counseling that, quote, the Spaniards intended to invade, as a great number of vessels and troops were expected from Havana and St. Augustine. A troubling sign arose when a few Carolinians actually began to defect to Florida. Africans in tow, in an act considered to be treason. After all, slavery appeared more stable in what was to become the Sunshine State than due north. When these fleeing settlers voted with their feet in favor of Madrid and not London, they tended to indicate that the later's model of colonial development would have difficulty surviving in a head-to-head contest with His Catholic Majesty's provinces. The bind in which Carolina found itself was exposed when Africans were sold to merchants in Florida. This too, it was thought, could bring fatal consequences, not only denuding the province of labor, but strengthening a foe and meaning taxes fall heavily on those who remained. Though the overriding concern was that the Africans, so sold to the Spaniards, might be employed in the murdering and plundering of His Majesty's subjects. Buying Africans, selling Africans, every turn seemed to bring peril. Likewise, Carolina policymakers were debating bills to prevent the stealing, carrying, enticing, and inveigling away Negroes and other slaves, unquote. Though one would think that reducing this population's sizable numbers would be their goal. The gravamen of this law was not unique to Charleston, for simultaneously in Delaware, Spaniards were landing and carrying off enslaved Africans while plundering plantations. I'm with you there, Robo. Those Africans still stuck in Carolina proved to be conspiratorial, that it would have been understandable if the authorities felt they had sold the wrong slaves to Spaniards. For in early 1747, a plot by Africans to poison fellow residents was revealed. Just one of many such plots that seemed to increase along with the slave trade. Poisoning seemed to be a recurring crime in colonial North Carolina, perhaps exceeding that other favorite, arson. Nevertheless, consistent with Stono, murder or attempted murder occasioned almost 25% of the executions of enslaved Africans in what was to emerge as the Tar Heel state, and most of their victims were of European origin. Thus, as Africans began once more surging into the mainland in greater numbers, increased disorder and combustibility accompanied their presence. And, once more, the authorities raised the alarm. This repetitive cycle, dragooning more handcuffed Africans, then warning dejectedly about their presence, suggested that these settlers were either playing a dangerous game or wagering that, in the end, they could effectively squash an African insurgency by sheer force of arms. Thus, in late 1748, officials in Virginia acknowledged that it was absolutely necessary that effectual provision should be made for the better of ordering of and governing of slaves, free Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, and detecting and punishing their secret plots and dangerous combinations. Indicatively, it was noted that, quote, many Negroes under the pretense of practicing physic have prepared and exhibited poisonous medicines, by which many persons have been murdered, unquote. African herbalists in South Carolina too knew far more about plants than most local doctors did, and, unsurprisingly, by the early 1750s, the province was gripped with hysteria over stories about poisonings by Africans practicing physic. Evidently, some Africans knew of botanical poisons so lethal that even the most competent official physicians in the colony had no effective antidotes. Nice. The local press argued that the horrid practice of poisoning white people by Negroes has lately become so common that within a few days past several executions of these alleged herb manipulators have taken place in different parts of the country by burning, hanging, and gibbeting. Similar executions also befell Africans in Georgia, who near the same time were accused of attempting to poison slaveholders. During the same period, prominent slaveholder Charles Perry was murdered in his home in Beaufort, South Carolina, by quote-unquote his slaves. Good question. Okay, I'm gonna look it up like this in case it gives me like a fucking picture or something. It's the use of a gallows-type structure from which dead or dying bodies of criminals were hanged on public display to deter other existing potential criminals. Occasionally, gibbeting was also used as a method of public execution, with the criminal being left to die of exposure. So it's just hanging them on a gallows until they die. Or it's the practice of hanging a bunch of dead or dying bodies from gallows in order to deter other people. So like Vlad the Impaler is like doing a type of gibbeting, but with a big impaling pole instead of a big like gallows. Yeah, just straight up medieval shit. Yeah, white people shit. I'm tired of calling it medieval shit. I'm not calling it medieval shit anymore. I'm calling it white people shit now. It's just, that's some white shit. It's some white ass shit is what it is. Well, I mean, so with this, right, Bob? Like, that's what this would do too. Because think about it. All gibbeting is literally just hanging you on a gallows pole like this until you die. Like this. See, leaving you like this exposed until you just die. They just hang you there. You're not hung by your neck, nothing like this. You die of exposure. That's gibbeting. During the same period, a prominent slaveholder, Charles Perry, was murdered in his home in Beaufort, South Carolina, by his slaves, reflecting the brutality of the slave system that had ensnared these Africans. He was stabbed in the eye and the chest and thrown into the river, his body weighed down by various items. Only the accidental recovery of his body the following day prevented the planned murder of two other prominent planters. A similar fate befell the father-in-law of William Drayton. The latter man was also part of the elite. Another African accused of poisoning his master was sold to Jamaica in May 1750, an island where his belligerents would fit nicely. The fright about poison was so pervasive that those Africans who purported to devise antidotes could gain freedom. Wow. Oh yeah, absolutely, Robo. I'm sure white people absolutely would walk by and be doing that. Yes. A traveler in 1750 conceded that the dangerous art of poisoning is known to the Negroes in North America, as has been frequently experienced. The fact that some of their poisons did not kill immediately made their handiwork even more effective and hard to detect. Indeed, if subsequently enacted slave codes in Georgia and South Carolina can withstand reasonable interference, they cry out with the conclusion that slaveholders in both provinces had become obsessed with the notion that they might be poisoned by enslaved Africans. Troubling for the colonists was the idea that poisoning slaveholders had spread to Massachusetts by 1755, as two Africans, male and female, were executed in Charleston for doing so. In faraway Louisiana, the authorities passed a bill forbidding the import of Africans from Hispaniola because so many deaths of Europeans of that island had occurred because of poisons administered by Africans. But these plots by Africans may have been minor in conception compared to what occurred in 1748, when an African in South Carolina issued an astounding confession about a conspiracy of him and his comrades to rise and cut off, kill the white people of this province, and then to make their escape to St. Augustine. But first, they would set the town and magazine afire. They would also murder all the Negroes that would not join them. One enslaved woman, in discussing her purported role in the plot, said she wanted to live as well as white people, with a good deal more. And another corroborated the overall contours of the conspiracy, though adding that Antigua might be their ultimate destination, a barely comforting substitution. But what made this plot soar in the sense beyond Stono and revealed the uncouth seams of London's colonial project was the alleged participation of an Irishman, and presumed Catholic, Lawrence Kelly, who hailed from Pennsylvania and had been in Carolina for 15 years. When queried, to the relief of the settlers, he asserted that he knew no one in St. Augustine, though this response could not erode the possibility that the desperate search for whites had led to the inevitable sleeper or long-term agents of Madrid stirring up Africans. Then Thomas Russ, one of the white people charged with, was interrogated and revealed that he was born in New England, which could be seen as a suggestive of regional strain that would implode in the next century, in 1861. Then John Matthews, also white, was charged and responded that yes, he knew Russ, but knew nothing of the conspiracy. Several Africans conceded that this plot had been hatched in concert with others of their status from surrounding plantations, and that some white persons too were involved, which widened the circle of mistrust. That their design was taken seriously was demonstrated when the governor took time out from his busy schedule to query witnesses himself. It was then that Kate, a Negro woman, declared that a boat with white men was to rest nearby in order to carry off the Africans after they had perpetrated their bold deeds. The targeted slaveholder, James Atkins, was understandably outraged by this plot, while Henry Lawrence, who had ministrations in aiding the arrival of so many Africans to Charleston, branded him as veritable accomplice, confirmed the existence of a horrible insurrection intended by the Negroes there. It would have been understandable if the governor had inferred that the participation of an Irish Catholic meant that the ubiquitous hand of His Catholic Majesty was asserting itself. If so, what did this mean for the policy encouraging whites generally to become settlers? Was this not just further invitation to Madrid and Paris to create deviltry? And since whites were thought to have been involved in Manhattan conflagration of 1741, did this episode in Carolina suggest that the increase in the number of Africans on the mainland also meant an increase in the kind of plotting of which they were so obviously capable? If those who were defined as white were conspiring against slavery, did this mean that London's incipient abolitionism had to be confronted more directly? If so, what did that mean for tranquil relations between the provinces and the metropolis? And did this also mean that perhaps incipient republicanism had to make itself more attractive precisely to foil the prospect of the germ of abolitionism spreading into the ranks of ever more Europeans? The broader point was that the proliferation of poisoning schemes, gruesome murders of slaveholders, and participation of Irish or white men in slave revolts all pointed to an escalating crisis on the mainland. As imports of enslaved rose, notably in Georgia, with pent-up demand for this valuable commodity, which rested uneasily and dangerously close to a vulnerable Carolina, revolts of the enslaved rose accordingly. And as these two yoked elements rose, a third rose in turn, incipient abolitionism. And as incipient abolitionism began to flower, settler confidence in London's ultimate intentions fell correspondingly. When Africans continued fleeing to Florida, as they did repeatedly in the 1740s, it was apparent that more firepower would be required to eliminate the Spanish threat and safeguard London's settlements. By this juncture, the ban on slavery in Georgia was a virtual dead letter, eroding Oglethorpe's dream of building a white, pro-slavery wall to block this mass flight. With inauthentic courage, Georgia mandated that each planter should employ one adult European male capable of bearing arms for every 4 African male slaves. But even if this had been sufficient to tie down the Africans, it was not clear what that would mean in the case of a Spanish invasion. Thus, Georgia had evolved from being a putative firewall in the transmission belt for Spanish thrusts into London settlements. In the same year as the abortive 1748 plot in South Carolina, lawmakers in Virginia felt it necessary to legislate further about raising a competent militia, in light of the fact that they were exposed to the invasions of foreign enemies by sea and incursions of Indians by land. And great dangers may likewise happen by a few insurrection of Negroes and others." Unquote. By 1749, it seemed that the view a few years earlier, that the subversion from Spaniards had been eliminated, was bizarrely inaccurate. "From St. Augustine," said one writer reporting from Charleston, "they seduced and encouraged our Negroes, our slaves, to desert. From Carolina, then, gave them freedom. There is hardly a week," it was said with distress, "but a dozen of them go off at a time in canoes." Unquote. The rabid confusion this turn of events was creating was indicated when in 1755, Georgia enacted a slave code that simultaneously sought to pulverize Africans while allowing them to join the militia. Why the contradiction? It was simply a reflection of a painfully redundant problem: how to enslave Africans so as to develop the economy while hindering their ability to rebel in league with settlers' antagonists. Countering these Africans was made all the more difficult because of the terrifyingly close proximity of Spanish St. Augustine and French Mobile. Yet, despite this implanted fissure of placing Africans in the militia, a cure that was arguably worse than the illness, through this same period, London was continuing to receive reports about Georgians trading with these very same putative enemies, Spain and France. The same accusation was laid at the doorstep of the affluent Carolinian James Edward Powell. In 1756, there was an unusual number of Spanish ships docking in Charleston on voyages from Cuba, said to be involved in an illicit tobacco trade. Perhaps rather than seeing these men as having a novel conception of allegiance to London, or even as ungrateful hypocrites, it might be better to see them as premature U.S. patriots. That is, economic logic was impelling them like a swift river current towards succession, while London was seeking to restrain their business dealings driven by the luscious bounty of African enslavement. Paris and Madrid had burst the dam and were more than willing to encourage settlers' shady bargains, and thus, these mainland men chose not to fight this trend but to embrace it, along with the petty profits it delivered. The combined strength of Paris and Madrid could outweigh that of London, and could preserve the existence of a new republic, which would then call for a temporary ceasefire in the religious wars by enshrining in its constitution freedom of faith. Bringing hosannas of praise from the presumably enlightened. The presumed enlightened then could cheer as the new republic garroted the divine right of monarchs, while undermining the challenge provided by a rising population of enslaved, and the feisty indigenist by opening the floodgates and admitting a tidal wave of European or white migrants. Is it all starting to come together now for you all? The latter, overjoyed by the opportunity to be reaped in the new continent, and their Enlightenment cheerleaders, could then readily turn a blind eye to the existence of enslaved Africans, and even their frequent revolts, which had propelled the lunge towards succession in the first instance. This blindness also made it difficult to acknowledge that the fire-lit skies of Manhattan were also enlightening, and that the repetitive poisoning plots provided a foretaste of what fate still awaited many settlers, unless there was a radical course correction, which arrived duly during the years stretching from 1756 to 1763. And with that, we learn about, next time on our read, Africans and the 7 Years' War, which again is what is going to take place between 1756 and 1763. So if you want to hear more from this book, join me on the next read.